Today we're going to be doing Canadian versus American chocolate bars.
I want candy. I want candy.
And having grown up in the States and now living in Canada, I know a lot about the chocolate in both countries. Now there's really a lot of overlap. We share most of the same candy bars, but there are a handful that are just Canadian or just American. And I'm not taking into account here that these chocolate bars might be found in other countries outside of the US and Canada. I'm just talking about the ones that are in either Canada and not the US, or vice versa. And when I say Canadian or an American chocolate bar, I mean that the manufacturer that makes that chocolate bar widely distributes it in either Canada or in the US, but not the other. But this doesn't mean, with the exception of one that we're going to talk about, this does not mean that it's illegal to sell that chocolate bar in the other countries, so it can be imported. But in general, it's either a Canadian chocolate or an American chocolate bar. And I've also included a few here that can be found in both countries, but I'm just going to be using them for comparison's sake because they're similar to one of the candies and I want to show you. And there's even two that are not chocolate, and you can probably guess why I'm including those. First, we're going to do a little brief overview of each chocolate bar. Then we're going to take a closer look into it, and then you and I are going to be doing some taste testing. First up is Smarties. Smarties were first launched in 1937 by H.I. Rowntree Company, but now they're owned by Nestle, and they are a Canadian chocolate. They're small little chocolate buttons, very similar to M&Ms. Both have a candy coating so that it doesn't melt in your hand. M&Ms can be found widely in both countries, but Smarties are only in Canada, because of course a different company owns the Smartie trademark in the US. These guys, Canadian Smarties versus American Smarties. But then of course the Smartie Candy Company, who owns these guys, wants to sell these in Canada too, so they sell them here as Rockets. But Rockets and Smarties, American Smarties, are exactly the same. They just have different names. And these two guys are the only non-chocolates in the list today, but I've just included them so that you can see the difference between American Smarties and Canadian Smarties. Smarties versus M&Ms. Smarties are a little bit bigger, and the M&Ms have an M on them. Chocolatey. They do taste really different, but I don't know how I would describe the difference between Smarties and M&Ms. Smarties are maybe a little bit more candy-like than the M&Ms. M&Ms are slightly more chocolatey, although that fake chocolate flavor, of course. I like both. Depends on the mood. The non-chocolates, Rockets versus Smarties. They're literally identical. In theory, these actually should be the same thing. Literally identical. No difference between the two. They're just sugar. The next American candy bar is the Milky Way, a personal favorite. It is nougat and caramel covered in chocolate, and it was developed in 1923 and is owned by the Mars Confectionery Company. And if you're Canadian, it might look pretty similar to this guy, which is called a Mars bar. It is also chocolate surrounding some nougat and caramel. It is also owned by the Mars Confectionery Company, but this one was developed in 1932, a little bit later, pretty much as a direct copy of the Milky Way bar. Now there was something called a Mars bar that was sold in the US until about 2002, but this was actually a different candy bar than what this one is. And then to make things even more confusing, Milky Way is apparently sold in Europe, but it's more like the Three Musketeers that's here in both Canada and the US, so it's not the same as this one. But these two, the Milky Way and the Mars bar, both space themed, both the same type of candy, the American version and the Canadian version, both owned by the same company. the Canadian Mars versus the American Milky Way. They look, I mean, pretty darn close. Mars bar? They're pretty much almost identical. Slight flavor differences that I wouldn't be able to explain, but pretty much the same. Mars and Milky Way, tied. Another Canadian candy is the Crispy Crunch. This is a peanut, hard, flaky inside covered in chocolate, and it was developed in 1930 and is owned by Cadbury. And it's pretty similar to a Butterfinger, which is available in both countries. Butterfingers were developed in 1923 and is owned by Nestle. And it's also a peanut, flaky, hard inside covered in chocolate. Even though it's available in both countries, I've included it here just for comparison's sake against the Crispy Crunch because they're so similar. So here's the Canadian Crispy Crunch, and here's both countries' Butterfinger. Now I do see Butterfinger literally everywhere in the US, and I see it a little bit less often here in Canada, but it's definitely in many places here. It's just got some competition. Now the Crispy Crunch was actually available in the US for a while too. It was distributed there in the 90s, but the company that took on distribution went bankrupt, so it's no longer there. This is a Canadian Crispy Crunch versus a Butterfinger in both countries. They look pretty similar. The Butterfinger is a lot flakier and softer than the Crispy Crunch is. And the flavors are similar, but also the outside of the Butterfinger is more melty than the Crispy Crunch is, and it's softer, just all around softer. And the flavor is maybe a little bit richer in the Butterfinger, I would say. Butterfinger wins over the Crispy Crunch. Whatchamacallits are an American candy bar. They are peanut flavored crisps covered in chocolate, and they were developed in 1978 and are owned by the Hershey Company. And I would kind of call these a more vintage candy because they're not as popular as they used to be, but they're still around. And Mr. Bigs are a Canadian chocolate bar. They're developed by Cadbury. I can't actually figure out when these first launched. They are a vanilla wafer and caramel Rice Crisps covered in chocolate. Actually, they call it a chocolate-like coating, so maybe not real chocolate. And they are actually starting to be distributed in the US as well, but not very widely, so I'm still qualifying these as a Canadian chocolate bar. Mr. Big. The Canadian Mr. Big and the American Whatchamacallit are actually pretty similar, even though one is wafer and one is crispy. The peanut flavored crisps kind of taste wafery, so these two are pretty similar actually. These next ones don't actually follow the rules of this video because both of them are distributed in both countries, but I'm including them anyway because they're essentially the same exact thing, and I would definitely consider one of them as being the Canadian version and one being the American version. In Canada, they are Maltesers. It's malted milk balls covered in chocolate, owned by the Mars Company, launched in 1937. And these used to be more Canadian, but they started being distributed in the US in 2017, so now you can find them in both countries. But they're essentially exactly the same thing as Whoppers, also available in both countries. These were developed a little bit later in 1949 and are owned by the Hershey Company, also malted milk balls covered in chocolate. And here they are up close, Canadian versus American. Of course, the Whoppers do come in a smaller package, but this is just what I found at the store at the time I went to look for them. look literally identical. Malteser, Whopper. The Whopper has a way richer taste. On the insides you can see a difference. The Malteser is a lot more airy versus the Whopper that is thick. It's a much, much richer taste than the Malteser is. So I guess it depends on what you like better. I like the Whoppers better. I feel like I'm definitely a little bit more biased here because I grew up in the States. So the US candies are what I grew up eating, so they probably have memories attached to them. Remember at the beginning of this video when I said that one of these chocolates is illegal and not able to be sold in one of the countries? Well, you probably guessed it, it's the Kinder Surprise Egg. So the Kinder Egg is a Canadian chocolate. It's chocolate egg with a milky coating, and there's a toy inside of the chocolate egg itself, which is inside of a little plastic case. And it is owned by Ferrero and was launched in 1974. But this one is illegal in the US. You're not even allowed to bring it into the US. So the FDA does not like this because they don't allow non-food items to be inside of a confectionery unless they serve some sort of purpose. But this one does not, so it's illegal. And one of the fun facts that kind of goes around about Kinder Eggs is that in 2011, over 60,000 of these were seized at the US border coming in from Canada because that's how badly Americans wanted these Kinder Eggs. But in 2017, Ferrero launched the Kinder Joy in the US. And they look the same on the outside, but the FDA still does not like this egg, so this one is quite a bit different. Only half of this is chocolate, and the other half is a toy. So the chocolate itself is also pretty different. It's got a creamy filling and some chocolate crispy wafer circles in it. And the toy is not inside of the chocolate at all, it's totally separate. So while they look the same on the outside, they are not at all the same on the inside. This is the Canadian Kinder Egg, and this is the American Kinder Egg. Kinder Egg. So this is the Canadian one. This is the little toy inside, or it's inside of this case. Definitely too big to be swallowed by a kid, probably. But still, FDA's worried about it. I mean, I've had this before. It tastes like really cheap Easter candy. I'm not a big fan of the Canadian Kinder Egg. Never had the American one before. The American one came in two halves, completely sealed from each other. Little cool car toy. Definitely couldn't mistake the toy for food. And then it's got this inside. The little balls are crunchy, and then that's creamy. I actually don't even see chocolate other than the balls. I kind of like the wafery things. They're like those wafer cookies, but I don't know. Actually, it's better than the Canadian one, I would say. American Kinder Egg wings. Both the US and Canada have chocolate caramel bars. They're chocolate filled with a creamy caramel filling. In Canada, we have Caramilks. They're owned by Cadbury and were launched in 1968. And in the US, we have Caramellos. These are actually owned by the Hershey Company, but their brand is Cadbury Caramellos. So these are pretty close to the same thing, except one is Caramilk and one is Caramello. The Caramello is really leaky. All the caramel comes out the sides when you break it open, and that's not happening in the caramel. The Caramello is a lot runnier and it's more parts caramel to chocolate, but I don't know if that's just the size of the Caramello bar that I got versus the size of the Caramilk bar that I got. I kind of like the way that the Caramello tastes better, but the Caramilk is way less messy, so I would vote the Caramilk. The US has an Almond Joy. Now an Almond Joy is basically the same as a Mounds, which is also an American candy. They're almost exactly the same thing. They're coconut and chocolate, except for the Almond Joy has a couple of almonds on top of it, and this one's milk chocolate, while Mounds is dark chocolate. Mounds were launched in 1920, and Almond Joys were launched in 1946. And then for coconut lovers in Canada, we've got the Bounty Bar. It is coconut covered in milk chocolate. It's owned by Mars and was first released in 1951, and this was actually available in the US for a while, but no longer is. The American Almond Joy, I don't really want to try because I hate coconut. I'm sure the Almond Joy is good. No offense to Almond Joy, I just happen to hate coconut. And now for the Canadian coconut one, the Bounty. Not looking forward to it. There's a reason why I didn't also get the Mounds for the American one. Well, I'm unfair to these because I just really hate coconut, but actually I gotta say the Bounty is slightly better than the Almond Joy. Slightly less coconutty? I don't know. In the US, we have got a toffee bar called the Heath Bar. It is English toffee covered in chocolate. It's owned by Hershey Company and was launched in 1914. And I'm going to compare it to Canada's Crunchie Bar. They are slightly different, but they're both toffee bars. The Crunchie Bar is sponge toffee covered in chocolate. It's owned by Cadbury and was launched in 1929. And I'm also going to include in here a Skor bar. So a Skor bar is actually available in both countries, but I'm including it just because of how similar it is to the Heath bar. The Skor bar is butter toffee and not English toffee, but it's also toffee covered in chocolate, owned by the Hershey Company and launched in 1981. And here's what all three of these look like. American, Canadian, and the middle one is both. These are definitely going to taste different because they're different types of toffee. This toffee kind of melts in your mouth. It seems big, but it melts right away. This one looks thicker. The Heath bar you have to crunch through. They're both very sugary. The Crunchie may be even more sugary. And then this is the Skor bar, available in both countries. Similar consistency, but slightly different flavor than the Heath bar. I actually prefer the Skor bar out of all three of those, the one that's available in both countries. Now we've got a bunch of chocolate bars that don't really have a good comparison between one country and the other, so I'm just going to show these ones solo. In Canada, we've got the Wunderbar. The Wunderbar is peanuts that are pretty crushed up, so it's actually smooth peanutty, and caramel covered in chocolate. These were developed in the 1980s and are owned by Cadbury, but this one's actually Cadbury Ireland, though they distribute it in Canada and not really in the US. And I could not find a great American comparison to this one. Like a chewy, peanut buttery, caramelly texture with some crunchy bits inside. They're a little bit too chewy for me. They're okay, they get a middle thumb. The US has a Mr. Goodbar, which is owned by Hershey and is just chocolate with peanuts in it. Mr. Goodbar. Tastes like a Hershey bar, which probably everyone's had before, with peanuts in it. I mean, there's not a lot to explain. It pretty much tastes as you would expect. Eh. You can take it or leave it. In Canada, we've got Aero bars. Aero's owned by Nestle and was launched in 1935. These actually made it to the US for a little while in the 80s, but they were pulled back out. It's aerated milk chocolate, and these actually now come in a bunch of different flavors, but milk chocolate is the most common and traditional flavor. Aero bar. See all the bubbles inside of the Aero bar? I like all the bubbles. The bubbles in Aero bars are cool because you just bite through them super easily. It's not a hard crunch, it's very soft. And it's kind of a cool texture. And then it just tastes like milk chocolate. Canada has Glosettes, which are chocolate covered raisins. They're owned by the Hershey Company, and I can't figure out when they first launched. And the US also actually has chocolate covered raisins called Raisinets. They're owned by Nestle and were launched in 1927, but I went to several stores, maybe 7 or 8 stores, and I couldn't find Raisinets. So maybe they're just not as popular anymore. I don't know if they're not being distributed. Maybe I would find them at a movie theater, but I couldn't find them, so we're only looking at Glosettes. They're basically the same thing though. Should cover raisins in chocolate. I've never had Glosettes before. I have had Raisinets before. It's been a long time since I've had Raisinets, but the Glosettes taste, I think they're sweeter than I remember Raisinets being, but it's been a long time, so I can't remember. A classic Canadian candy is Coffee Crisp. It is vanilla wafer with some coffee in between and surrounded in milk chocolate. It's owned by Nestle and was launched in 1938. Coffee and wafer-like, as one might expect. Coffee Crisp is probably the least sweet of all of the candies today, which is kind of good right now after eating all those candy. In the US, we've got the 100-gram bar. This is owned by Nestle and was launched in 1966. It is chocolate and caramel with crispy crunches inside. I mean, 100-gram tastes like caramel with some like Rice Krispies in it. It's about what it tastes like. Easy to explain. I like the Rice Krispies. One that I have never tried before is the Canadian Big Turk. This is Turkish Delight covered in chocolate. It's owned by Nestle and I cannot find what date it was first launched. I really don't want to try the Canadian Big Turk. I've never had this before. Turkish Delights are not my favorite. It's like magenta colored on the inside. It's quite a weird color for food that's not a berry. I hate even the taste of it. It tastes kind of like a gummy worm or something covered in chocolate, which some people could like, not me. Big Turk, big thumbs down, but if you like Turkish Delight or fruity candies, you probably like it. Now that was a lot of chocolate analysis, and even after all that, I know that I'm missing some. Being an American living in Canada, it's a lot easier for me to recognize candy bars that are new to me than it is to recognize candy bars that I can no longer find. So I'm guessing that I'm missing far more American ones than Canadian ones, but I don't know. You tell me, what did I miss? And thanks for watching. Bye.